So we have, in the previous 14 episodes, been covering the work of St. Robert Bellarmine and the controversy on the Roman Pontiff. This is a work that was written in the 1560s in response to the claims made by Protestant revolutionaries, Martin Luther, Illyricus, and John Calvin, among others. And we have been referring to St. Robert Bellarmine's work, which is over 1.5 million words in totality, and his singular, magnificent effort in answering every single one of the charges that was leveled by Calvin, Luther, et al., and in answering them thoroughly and in a convincing and historical manner. And what Bellarmine did was basically to answer the charges one by one with what the evidence that he could produce would render. And in almost every instance, it was that either A, the charge was made up, B, if it wasn't made up and had some validity to it, although I hesitate to use the term valid, that it was trumped up, meaning it was wildly exaggerated. And then C, were some of these charges ever actually leveled in the manner in which people said that they were leveled? And if they were, well, then what was the answer to them? In other words, there were some clarifications in there as well. And we have made it all the way to chapter 30 of volume 2, which is the penultimate chapter of that work. And I believe we're going to try to get to the end today and get all the way so we can start on volume 3 next week. And so we'll bring in our Latinist expert and my co-host for this little journey, Ryan Grant. He, the proprietor of Mediatrix Press. That's M-E-D-I-A, Mediatrix, T-R-I-X-P-R-E-S-S, MediatrixPress.com. Ryan Grant, who translated from the original Latin all of these words. Now, you haven't gotten to the entire 1.5 million, or have you done the entire 1.5 million words, Ryan? Welcome.
Well, thank you. No, sadly I have not. I wish I had. What I've done so far is, I'm not even sure, I should actually look at a word count. I haven't done a word count on it yet, but I've translated basically only a handful of books. Just on the Roman Pontiff just happens to be probably the largest of any single book in the entirety of the controversies, except possibly for his treatise on the Holy Eucharist and in the section on the sacraments. And also, I think Indulgences is very close. It's also a very massive book. So, so basically, because the whole course of the controversies, the Roman Pontiff was the third book, was preceded by a treatise on Scripture, then on Christology. Then came on the Roman Pontiff, so you see that order. Then the next volume's on the Church. I've done 2 sections from that particular work. One was on the marks of the Church. We'll talk about that one a little bit today, actually, some of the stuff we have to deal with. And then on the Church Militant, which I just published, which is this treatise on ecclesiology, basically an overview of what the church is, who's in it. Is it a visible church? Is it an invisible church, as the Reformers said? So, and then it continues there, purgatory, and then it says on the Church Triumphant, but it's not so much just mere questions in the beatific vision. It's actually, or a spiritual treatise. It's a doctrinal treatise of relics, images, veneration of saints, the infallibility and beatifications, the canonizations, right, all answering Protestant arguments against those particular things. And then it continues on into the sacraments, all 7 sacraments. It's a very lengthy tome. And then the last section on grace, free will, and justification, then also indulgences. And so,
wow.
And at this point too, as people have been watching, it just released on the Church Militant, was just book 3 of the first volume on the Church, right? I skipped on the councils. Because frankly, that first councils volume dragged it, because he's just enumerating the councils, which ones are infallible, or which ones were held as councils, and going through different questions, and it started to bog down. So I just diverted my attention to the Church Militant. That's why I put that one out there. And I should probably go back to the authority of councils, but I'm actually looking at excerpting other works that might be of importance or of the moment to try to get them out there faster. So I'm still making decisions about which one I am or am not going to do. So anyway, eventually the whole 2 million or so words in Latin will be translated. It'll be more than that in English, because English is much more wordy than Latin. So necessarily, eventually it's going to happen. Just haven't quite got there yet.
So that's a bit of a recap of the entire series. Now, for a bit of a recap of what we have discussed this far, St. Robert Bellarmine in this particular work has answered every question under the sun that could possibly be leveled by the revolutionaries. In chapter 28 last week, we heard the objections, actually, of John Calvin, answered by St. Robert Bellarmine. And in one of them, there was almost, you could see that Bellarmine was almost laughing, almost joking at one of the questions because it was so ridiculous in nature. Bellarmine went ahead and answered the charge anyways, but he answered it with beginning with what you would call in modern times as a joke, basically, an either-or joke. And then we proceeded and we left off, and we were just about getting ready to start in chapter 30 of the second volume, which is the last argument is answered, wherein the argument is taken up whether a heretical pope can be deposed. So I guess we could pick up from there, unless you want to review where we left off in chapter 29.
Well, chapter 29 would just simplify it. It's where Bellarmine turns to questions of older heretics, medieval heretics, and or even heresies in the early church and how the church refuted it, because it's going to set up partially this question, but also as a buttress to the fact that, which he brings out more fully in his work on the marks of the church, De Notis Ecclesiae, where he basically shows that a lot of the things that the Protestants teach were condemned by the early church as heresies. So and then he's, because that was one argument, is that, oh, we're the early church. We're the, that was the whole point, for example, the centuries of Magdeburg, to show that the early church was Lutheran, not Catholic, right? And before the fact. And so when you actually look at what the early church taught, you find that virtually everything Luther said was condemned. So that was the purpose for that chapter 29, to show what the older heretics had taught. And not only just how Protestants often teach the same thing, but even how these particular doctrines prove that the church through the ages has believed what we're saying she does. So now we come to this last question, which is whether a heretical pope can be deposed. So now he's retreating into a specifically Catholic argument. So actually, we're not even really dealing with Calvin is wrong in this one so much, because he doesn't appear here. Okay. Instead, you get different theologians who argue different questions about what happens if you have a heretical pope, basically. And it's interesting not the language, because then there's people today, and we're going to be talking about them a little bit, probably alienate some customers of mine, but there we go. They're called sedevacantists. So there's people in the Catholic Church who believe that the pope is that the popes since Vatican II have all been heretical, and therefore haven't been real popes. And so we'll talk about why that absolutely cannot be. Because they claim this chapter as the reason for that. So
that is.
So he starts.
I was going to say that is a. I would like to just reiterate. Ryan's via Skype, and I'm on the live mic. That the question on sedevacantism. This is a great example of a Latin conjugation, right, Ryan? Because sede is right hand or hand. And vacantism is obviously vacant, so it would be
sede is seat. It was an example of
seat, right.
Yes, so sede vacante is an ablative absolute, the seat being empty. Basically, is how it would be rendered. And so we would render it in English as a noun rather than the nominative absolute. So you'd say that it was, the seat is vacant. Now, we actually do get sede vacante, in as much as whenever a pope dies and you have another pope that comes into being.
Right.
And so I'll actually pick that question up a little later after we get through this, and we start talking about the problems with how this is read by certain people today. So for a long time, actually, part of this chapter, but not the whole chapter, because that would be damning to some people's positions, was up on the internet for years and years, and so people could read it. They just had it picked up midway, and I'll tell you what that point is. Where this has been on websites, and my translation did a little better job, in my opinion. But nevertheless, that's so it had been up there for a while. And
it was to answer this question.
My book was the very first time the entire thing was available to be read in English, because before that it was only a certain section of this chapter that was up, because they wanted it framed in a certain way. You see.
Okay, so I'll play the sedevacantists, and I'll ask the question, and then you can pick it up from there. The 10th argument: a pope can be judged and deposed by the church in the case of heresy, as is clear from Distinction 40, and that is Con Si Papa. Therefore,
Canon. No, the canon is an abbreviation. So then canon, C Papa.
C Papa. Therefore, the Pontiff is subject to human judgment, at least in some case.
Okay, good. So that's the argument. So this is, so that's a medieval canon, and it makes up part of canon laws. When they say distinction, that means a particular point of canon law or laws that come down. And so there was this canon C Papa, which held basically that if a pope, became a heretic, the church had to issue a declaratory sentence. And so Bellarmine actually will pick this up in Book 4 and exactly, explain that canon a little more. But anyway, so he goes, I respond, there are 5 opinions on this matter. The first is of Albert Pigius, who's a medieval theologian, who contends that the Pope cannot be a heretic and hence would not be deposed in any case. Such an opinion is probable and can easily be defended, as we will show in its proper place. Nevertheless, excuse me, because it is not certain and the common opinion is to the contrary, it will be worthwhile to see what the response should be if the Pope could be a heretic. Thus, the second opinion is that the Pope, in the very instant in which he falls into heresy, even if it is only interior, is outside the Church and deposed by God, for which reason he can be judged by the Church. That is, he is declared deposed by divine law and deposed de facto, if he still refused to yield. This is the opinion of John de Torquemada, but it is not proven to me. That actually, I probably should go back and re-render that. Because that's an impersonal thing. But, I don't find this to be proven. For jurisdiction is certainly given to the Pontiff by God, but with the agreement of men, as is obvious. Because this man, who beforehand was not Pope, has from men that he would begin to be Pope. That is, he's talking about the proximate authority, the process of election whereby he becomes that. Therefore, he is not removed by God unless it is through men. But a secret heretic cannot be judged by men, nor would such a man wish to relinquish that power by his own will. Add to this, that the foundation of this opinion is that secret heretics are outside the Church, which is false, and we will amply demonstrate this in our tract De Ecclesia, Book 1. Actually, that's wrong there. It should be Book 3. But so nevertheless, what he's talking about there. So the second opinion is actually the opinion that most sedevacantists hold today. And Bellarmine says it's absolutely false, because its entire foundation is on a falsehood. So, but nevertheless, you still see that proliferate. Basically, as soon as the Pope falls into any kind of heresy, period, right? So that's when people wig out when Francis says something nutty, like he did the other day, and because never. And of course, on that note, too, with the Pope saying nutty things,
right,
if
please.
you had a microphone around various popes in the Middle Ages, people would be scandalized by certain things that were said. So, for example, there was, in the life of Leo X, we read this by a number of contemporary accounts. There were, so at a banquet. Now, Leo X was the first Medici Pope. He was the son of Alessandro il Magnifico, right? And so he had his name escapes me. It wasn't Alexander, but it was, anyway, his name is not coming to my head right now. That's all right.
All right.
One of the great Medicis, anyway, he was his son, right? And so now he's Pope, and he's at this great banquet. And he's various cardinals around, and some priests, some theologians of the papal court, and and he's looking at this magnificent dinner of like 5 and 6, 7, 8 courses, and he's just marveling. And he says, "My friends, what great gain we've made from this superstition of Christ." Now, imagine Francis said this today, people will be, going apoplectic, right, in Facebook and in various trad Catholic circles. Well, but Leo X said that 500 years ago, and the Church never said. Church didn't collapse. Church didn't end. Nobody, claimed he ceased to be Pope at that very minute.
But,
so that's.
What you could say is, and I think you termed this properly, the recording device wasn't invented then. There was no stenographer or secretary of the Pope that was walking behind him with a notepad and a bottle of ink and a quill pen scribbling down everything that he said to everyone. If we conform our minds to that reality, I think it's perfectly logical that because man is always man and it is fallen, that of course there were popes that said weird and goofy and strange things, just like Mike Church has said weird and goofy and strange things today, and so is Ryan Grant. And so is anyone. We don't have a press corps that's waiting around and hanging on every word and then publishing it as if it's doctrine. And I think what's really going on here is that for the first time, the Catholic-hating press can actually, and the Catholic-hating public, the bigoted public, can actually seize upon the ramblings of Francis and say, see, told ya. And it's almost like it's a nanya boo-boo is what's going on here today. And Ryan, there was a term that was used, and I hate to use it for the Holy Father because I do owe him my respect and allegiance. He is the Vicar of Christ. But there was a term that was used in the 1940s and early 1950s for those that had been duped by the Soviets. They were called useful idiots. Well, unfortunately, many of the things that Pope Francis has said has been seized upon by the apostates and the heretics, and are being employed by those particular, his ramblings are being employed by those people. And so you may not call him that name, but you can say what he's saying is usefully idiotic, I guess. And I think that helps maybe explain it a little bit. And he's not infallible in any of these things either.
No, he's not. And even in the most recent post-synodal document, Cardinal Burke called it correctly that it is of absolutely no authority whatsoever as a magisterial document. So it's these are things not to get worried about, not to get worked up about. So and here's one of the things we're going to talk about, and Bellarmine alludes to this, and even Bellarmine holds this opinion contrary to what, say, for example, Sedevacantists today argue. And essentially that he says, men must be involved in this process because men were involved in the process to put him there, even though they didn't actually create the power that made him pope, nor do they actually take it away, but they're still involved in the process. That is, the church has to give a summary judgment as in a declaratory sentence, but not to directly judge. But we'll get to that as we get to it. And so anyway, so that's the second opinion that, he completely rejects, because its foundation is contrary to proper ecclesiology. That's, of course, what's held by most Sedevacantists. That's why, for example, they put, when my book came out, they promoted it, which, hey, I was happy for. I don't mind sales. But I hope they read the whole thing, which they won't. So, in fact, it showed because both Father Ciccato is a big guru for Sedevacantism. Nice guy, at least in my dealings with him. But he put this up and he completely cut this part out. Didn't put this part up. He only put starting with the discussion of the fourth opinion. So anyway, let's move on to the next opinion.
Okay.
The third opinion is on another extreme. Okay, so the first extreme, as soon as he falls into heresy, he ceases to be Pope. Bellarmine says it's not true, it has a bad foundation. The third opinion is the other extreme, that the Pope is not and cannot be deposed, either by for secret or manifest heresy. Torquemada in the aforementioned citation relates and refutes this opinion, and rightly so, for it is exceedingly improbable. First, because that a heretical pope can be judged as expressly held in this canon, see Papa, and with Pope Innocent III. And what is more, in the Fourth Council of Constantinople, Act 7, the acts of the Roman Council under Hadrian were recited, and in those it was contained that Pope Honorius appeared to be legally anathematized because he had been convicted of heresy. The only reason where it is lawful for inferiors to judge superiors. Here the fact must be remarked upon that, although it is probable that Honorius was not a heretic, and that Pope Hadrian II was deceived by corrupted copies of the Sixth Council, that falsely reckoned Honorius was a heretic, we still can't deny that Hadrian, with the Roman Council and the whole Eighth Synod, that is the Eighth Council, sensed that in the case of heresy, a Roman pontiff can be judged, and that it would be the most miserable condition for the Church herself, were she to be compelled to recognize a wolf manifestly prowling as her shepherd. Okay, so that's then that's the other opinion, that it could never happen that the Pope could even be deposed at all for any reason, even if he were a heretic. So thus he's laying the ground down that it can indeed happen, because to have basically the wolf as your shepherd. I think the Latin here is lupus pro pastore. It's it is a miserable condition for the Church, right? So now we come to the fourth opinion, and this is where for years, from this quote onwards, was picked up by the Sedevacantist website. So I'll read it, and then we'll talk about some of the issues involved canonically and such things. The fourth opinion is that of Cajetan. Cajetan was a Dominican theologian, by the way, earlier in the century, famous Dominican theologian. There he teaches that a manifestly heretical pope is not ipso facto deposed, from the Latin by that very fact, but can and ought to be deposed by the Church. Now, in my judgment, such an opinion cannot be defended. For in the first place, that a manifestly or that a manifest heretic would be ipso facto deposed seems to be proven from authority and reason. The authority is of St. Paul, who commands Titus that after 2 censures, that is, after he appears manifestly pertinacious, a heretic is to be shunned. And he understands this before excommunication and sentence, before the excommunication and sentence of a judge. Jerome comments on the same place, saying that other sinners, through judgment of excommunication, are excluded from the church. Heretics, however, leave by themselves and are cut off from the body of Christ. But a pope who remains the pope cannot be avoided. How will we shun our head? How will we recede from a member to whom we are bound to obey? Now, in regard to reason, this is indeed very certain. A non-Christian cannot in any way be pope, as Cajetan affirms in the same book. And the reason is because he cannot be the head of that which he is not a member. And he is not a member of the church who is not a Christian. But a manifest heretic is not a Christian, as St. Cyprian and many other fathers clearly teach. Therefore, a manifest heretic cannot be pope. Cajetan responds in a defense of the aforementioned treatise, chapter 25, and in the treatise itself, chapter 22, that a heretic is not a Christian simply, but is relatively. For since 2 things make one a Christian, faith and the character of baptism, a heretic loses the virtue of faith, but still retains the character, and for that reason, still adheres in some way to the church, and has the capacity for jurisdiction. Hence, he is still pope. But he must be deposed, because he has been disposed because he has been disposed to heresy.
Right.
After being disposed at the last, he is not pope. As such, he is a man, and not yet dead, but constituted at the point of death. So then he goes on to refute this. He says, on the contrary, since in the first place, were a heretic to remain joined with the church and act by reason of the baptismal character, he could never be cut off and separated from her, because the character is indelible. Yet everyone affirms that some can be cut off from the church de facto, right, by the of that fact. So actually, that's an important point too in ecclesiology, because today you have all these people running around. Oh, once Catholic, always Catholic, because they got the character of baptism. So even if they've denied the church and they're still really Catholic, because so therefore nobody's really outside the church. And that's just a bunch of hooey ecclesiologically.
Boy,
and
howdy.
it shows why. Because if that was true, that he says it in his work on the church militant, he says that if that were true, that someone was in the church by reason of their character, then it would follow that all those in hell were in the church, and the church was actually in hell, which is also fictitious.
This is hang on, let me do a station ID real quick. This is The Modern Wrong World Made Right. Calvin Was Wrong, episode number 15. We are with our Latinist expert and the publisher of De Controversies on the Roman Pontiff, Ryan Grant of Mediatrix Press. You can find this book that we are referring to, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and Volume 3, in my store at mikechurch.com/shop, at Mediatrix Press. That's Mediatrix Press.com. And I tell you what, Ryan, why don't we just pause here before you get on to on the contrary of the, I believe we're on the 4th argument here, and we'll pick up on the other side of this. And folks, if you find this conversation interesting and informative and rewarding, then you will love the previous 14 episodes and all the other stuff that we keep behind the curtain at VeritasRadioNetwork.com. Why not join our crusade today and become a Founders Pass member, and you would have download access, instant streaming and download access to this show and to my show, which is on every weekday morning from 8 to 11 a.m.-ish right here on the Crusade channel. You can subscribe to the Founders Pass for as little as 23 cents per day. You can also choose between a monthly or yearly membership, and during the month of June, for every new Founders Pass yearly membership purchased, we'll ship you an autographed copy of Washington Irving's Life of Washington, Volume 1, in hardback, edited and autographed by the editor. That's me, yours truly. It's a great book. That's a $50 value, and you get it free for becoming a Founders Pass member. Why not join now and not put it off? Join our crusade today and become a Founders Pass member by going to VeritasRadioNetwork.com/join or call 866-483-3833. The Veritas Radio Network, radio the way it should be. We'll take our time out, Mediatrix Press.com. And also on the Twitter, although, Ryan, you don't seem to use the Twitter feed as much as the Facebook.
tell you the truth, I don't really understand how Twitter works or what you're supposed to do with it. So it's one of those things that, even a friend of mine said that was giving me advice on marketing. And said, Twitter, everyone knows that's like the weakest thing in your whole bag of tools. And so I was like, why bother? Facebook's where, maybe I should do something, but it's just, there's so many things to have to deal with, because I do the layout, I do the publishing, all those nice flourishes you see in the books that I'm doing, and I'm getting those better now, as I have a font that does that instead of using pictures from 16th century books and cleaning them up in Photoshop. Then I do all the print editing. I do any pictures that are in there. I debug files for ebook. I do basically everything. And my wife manages the children every once in a while. She's free, so she can look at something and edit. Then I've got some volunteer proofreaders, but. It's the whole thing's a labor. So not just the translations I do like this one, but also books I reprint. I have to do all of that work and all that editing and, going over, make sure proofreaders didn't miss things, which everybody does. That's why you need several. So, trying to make sure, so all those things go into it. And then I'm looking at the end of the day, do I want to learn Twitter? Nah.
I was going to try my hand at Latin since I'm learning it at Ryan Grant Dixit Chorus. How close was I? And Ryan Grant was spoke to the choir.
Dixit ad chorum.
Dixit. Okay, I was close. I'm getting better. Thanks to Father William Most, another great book that Ryan's published. If you want to learn Latin, get this book. Latin by the Natural Method. As you can see, Ryan, I almost made a cohesive, correctly, in a correct case, in a correct tense and everything sentence. Not there yet, but I'm getting there.
Well, you did better than some graduates with classics degrees from Harvard. So maybe the only reason they studied it at all was to read the Greek on the sorority girl shirts. So you did pretty good.
Well, let's pick up where we left off. But on the contrary, since in the first place we're a heretic to remain joined with the church, we are now in chapter 30, by the by, of the controversy on the Roman Pontiff, the work by St. Robert Bellarmine. And chapter 30 deals with, I'll just reset the question, the last argument that was made in this particular volume is whether or not the Pope can be deposed by the church in case of heresy. And Ryan is translating and giving us the answers that Bellarmine gave to those who today we would call sedevacantists. Now, what were they called at that time? Who was he addressing this concern to at that time?
Well, simply, it's an inter-theological discussion. It's really meant to determine the truth of the matter and lay down the principles whereby it could happen. So you have... there's different theologians of different traditions that all held different things, I might add.
Okay.
And they're canonists, and the cadre of canonists in that time, most of the popes in this period, of course, will come from the ranks of canonists, right? Especially, Pope Pius IV, Pope Sixtus V, Pope Paul V, actually Pope Paul IV too, come to think of it. All these, Pope Clement VIII was a canonist, Pope Gregory XV was a canonist, right? The first one in the whole string that wasn't a canonist is when you get to Urban VIII, after about 2 years after Bellarmine died. So the canonists held to a very, more medieval view of things, and so they took an absolutely strict extreme on the authority of the church, that basically the Pope was the king of the entire world, and all kings, all princes were merely just his vassals, his headmen, that were the guy who executed his will. And that was a certain interpretation that some canonists had in the Middle Ages. Never had the authority of the church. It was never explicated in theology. All good theologians, especially fathers of the church, doctors of the church, St. Thomas, St. Bonaventure, Alexander of Hales, all these great theological names had rejected that position absolutely. So that's what makes up Book 5, by the way, the whole consideration that the Pope only has indirect power over the world. So it was these particular candidates, for example, that were agitating for the excommunication of Queen Elizabeth, which everyone in the tradition, even back then, notes was a big mistake. Even Pius V had regrets about it when he heard how Catholics were, what they had to suffer on account of it. So but anyway, so that's one group they're dealing with, is the canonists. And so then the other is the question of sorting out this position, which we loosely call the Dominican position, because it's exemplified by Dominican theologians from Cajetan to John of St. Thomas, de Groot, who's a great Dominican theologian in the 20th century, all the way to Garrigou-Lagrange. basically hold an opinion very similar to this. Not quite in the same terms that Cajetan does, but mostly because actually what Bellarmine shows here, it puts holes in it, so they had to revise their position slightly. So, and we'll get to the importance of that in a few minutes. So anyway, so he continues to discuss that, so being, having the character doesn't make you in the church. And he quotes St. Thomas to that effect. So he says, therefore, since the character pertains to what is internal and not external, according to St. Thomas, then the character, that is the mark of baptism, alone does not unite a man with Christ in act. Right? Remember the Aristotelian difference of act and potency. Potency, obviously,
Right.
potential could be, but it's not yet. Act as it actually is. So one's in the church in potency, for example, a catechumen who has the faith but is not yet been baptized, provided he's got true charity and everything. In potency might be someone who's been excommunicated and excluded from the church that, whether it was unjust or not, he's got true contrition and is ready to, it believes exactly what the church believes and is ready, but hasn't been reconciled. Right? So he would be a member in potency, but not an act. And so that comes out in the ecclesiology section too from Bellarmine. So anyway, he goes on. Next, either faith is a necessary disposition as one for this purpose, that someone should be pope, or it's merely that he be a good pope. If it's the first, then after that disposition has been abolished through its opposite, that is unbelief or heresy, and willful unbelief, so heresy, and soon after the pope ceases to be pope. For the form cannot be preserved without its necessary dispositions. If it's the second, then a pope cannot be deposed on account of heresy at all. Rather, he should be, in general, he ought to be deposed even on account of ignorance and wickedness and other dispositions which are necessary to be a good pope. And besides, Cajetan affirms that the pope cannot be deposed from a defect of dispositions that are not necessary, as is simply, but merely necessary for one to be a good pope. So, anyway, so we can go on with this, but it's there to be read in the book. So basically, to summarize it, so Cajetan's position in summary is that if a pope should become, a manifest heretic, so remember, that's what we're talking about, is a manifest heretic, not a secret heretic. What's a manifest heretic? Well, everyone takes their cue from St. Thomas's definition, which is in the Summa, and he says essentially that somebody who is a manifest heretic refuses to believe something from the obstinacy of the will. Right, so that's he knows what the truth is. It's something that has been revealed as de fide, or is such that by his knowledge, from a consensus of theologians, is held to be de fide but non definita. Right, there's certain positions like that, like canonizations of saints, doctrines on the beatific vision. All these are held basically by the common teaching of theologians to be de fide and non definita. Right, so those can be a sin against faith to deny as well. But anyway, for the moment. So so he has to be something that's already been revealed, that he knows is revealed in his Catholic, it's de fide, Catholic truth, it's of the faith, and he obstinately denies it. Right, that's a manifest heretic. Whereas St. Thomas also says that one in ignorance could say even the most blasphemous, absurd, he says it in the Summa, most ridiculous heresy. And yet, if he does not will to deny something that the church has revealed, right, he's not obstinate, he has the disposition to immediately amend as soon as the church corrects him, then such a person is not a heretic, not a manifest heretic.
Okay, so then that would mean, then, just to explain, to try to relate this to the modern world, modern wrong world made right, and people's opinion of Francis when they say this about the Holy Father today, all those things that he rambles about and that the microphones pick up and that people pass around on Facebook and on Twitter and on their WordPress pages and on blogs, et cetera, none of those things rise to this level here. As a matter of fact, I'm just reading that here at the end, and this is put really, really simply by Bellarmine. And if you don't mind, Ryan, I'd just like to reiterate this from your translation that's in the book, that... and that he adds in the last chapter, 12th argument, that someone cannot even be informed in thought that he should be head and pope who is not a member nor a part. And he teaches the same thing. I guess he's talking about Cajetan here. And he teaches the same thing in eloquent words, that secret heretics are still in the church and are parts and members, and that a secretly heretical pope is still pope. Others teach the same, whom we cite in Book 1 of De Ecclesia. And then he goes into the explanation. So he could harbor all the heretical. I mean, he may be saying these things as dropping hints that he harbors these heretical thoughts, and he hasn't actually came out with them yet, which seems to me to more aptly describe what we've heard in the last 4 years. But if he doesn't actually utter them, and if he's not, what's the word about, or the term for the ignorant, invincibly ignorant? If he's not invincibly ignorant on it, well, then it would not apply.
Well, he couldn't be invincibly ignorant on it because he has, theologians to correct him, cardinals, and he has been corrected.
He has been, right.
And sometimes they do the track back, like the most recent thing, where to save face, either that or maybe there's something inside where, the Vatican press office just went ahead without the Pope's go-ahead to change what he said in the transcript. But this whole recent thing on marriage, for example, they knew that was blasphemous and dangerous theologically, and so they immediately edited those remarks from the official transcript, even though everyone in the world's got YouTube and can see he clearly said that.
Right.
So, whether that's at the Pope's behest or simply to correct it real quick before somebody figures it out. But I mean, because that statement is itself, as said, he might not have meant it this way. He might have been intending to address a particular by an overgeneralization, but not being qualified, it actually becomes blasphemous because it's a false presumption, because the theologians all teach in their treatises on sacraments in general that if really we have no certitude, absolute certitude, that any sacrament we get is valid, because there's the remote possibility that a bishop withheld his intention when he consecrated this priest. And that has happened before in history. There was an example in San Francisco, I think it was, or somewhere in California, where they had a bishop who hated Jesuits. And this is before the time where we all have a reason to not like Jesuits very much. He hated Jesuits. And so
I was getting ready to say.
Every Jesuit presented to me for ordination, I'm going to withhold my intention. So he confessed this to a priest on his deathbed. And then the priest said, all right, I cannot absolve you. You have to make restitution for this. You have to tell someone what you did. So he did, and then finally got his absolution, and he died. Well, they had to go through records, every single Jesuit this guy ever ordained, and they had to basically pull the guy in the back room. You're not a priest, so we're going to fix that. And just very quietly, they had to, go through any records of things that marriages and other things that were potentially affected by that. It's a huge, huge problem. So, that can happen. But can it happen everywhere? See, and that's the issue, is that we have to have, because Christ instituted the sacraments for our salvation, you have to have the trust that he would not allow them all to be corrupted. So that is the idea that all marriages are invalid. It's just absurd, because there's no way. But sorry, we're running out of time, so I got to summarize and skim here. So anyway, so Cajetan's opinion is essentially that, yes, if the Pope becomes a manifest heretic, then he has to be deposed by the church. But he's not clear on exactly what this means. This gets refined later to actually that the church needs to provide a declaratory sentence on what God has done, because the church doesn't have the power to depose him. And that's what Bellarmine, shows at length here, that obviously, because the church is not above the Pope. So then he relates the fifth true opinion, where Bellarmine says, quote, a pope who is a manifest heretic ceases in himself to be pope and head, just as he ceases in himself to be a Christian and a member of the body of the church, whereby he can be judged and punished by the church. That's an important point. Notice, where he can be judged and punished by the church. This is the opinion of all the ancient fathers who teach that manifest heretics soon lose all jurisdiction, namely St. Cyprian, who speaks under the heretic novation, etc. I'm going to skip through that a little bit. So the opinion of learned men of our age is the same. John Drydo teaches they who are cast out as excommunicates or leave on their own and oppose the church they are separated from it as heretics and schismatics. He adds in the same work that those who have departed from the church maintain no spiritual power over those who are in the church. Melchior Cano, another Dominican theologian, teaches the same thing when he says that heretics are not part of the church nor members. And he adds in the last chapter, chapter 12, the argument that someone cannot even be informed in thought so as to be head and pope, who is not a member nor a part. And this is in De Locis Theologiis, one of its important document that was up until about 60 years ago, is studied very frequently in theology.
Why does it always come up that it was important until about 60 years ago?
Right. Same thing with Bellarmine. And he, of course, it's only because of the Sedevacantists that renewed interest in Bellarmine appears, because, once the Jesuits fell, You're no longer talking about Bellarmine anymore. Now it's Teilhard de Chardin, 33 and a third cheers for Teilhard de Chardin. Bellarmine, who's that? And that, kind of reduces his authority in theology, and he starts, dissipating and that's the problem is only being in Latin. It was easy for the modernists who took control of seminary instruction in the 60s and 70s to basically cut off all seminarians, all future priests from the tradition by saying, we don't need Latin anymore, don't learn Latin anymore, disparaging it, even though formally it still had to be taught. In fact, it wasn't being taught anymore on purpose. They didn't want that anymore. If you asked for Latin in seminary, you'd be thrown out. If you're praying your rosary in Latin, you'd be thrown out. If you wanted to say Mass in Latin, you'd be thrown out. That's how it developed, where, when they took these things over to divorce you from the tradition. And so that's why you didn't study this stuff anymore. You couldn't, unless you were one of those rare people that really got out there the gumption and taught yourself Latin or something, or learned at a university and were decent at it. So anyway.
I guess that makes me a weird person.
Yeah, me too. So the foundation of this opinion is that a manifest heretic is in no way a member of the church, that is neither in spirit nor in body, or by an internal union, or external. For even wicked Catholics are united and are members, in spirit through faith and in body through the confession of faith, and the participation of the visible sacraments. Secret heretics are united and are members, but only by an external union, just as on the other hand, good catechumens are in the church only by an internal union, but not an external one. Manifest heretics by no union, as has been proved. So just to explain what this means, he says that, of course, judged and punished by the church. So that because what does ipso facto mean, canonically speaking? All right, the word ipso facto, by that very fact, means in law that the fact has to be established. Right, and so you need a body to establish it. So the difference between the position of Cajetan, which ultimately returns into the Dominican position, like I said, Melchior Cano, Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, all the way through great theologians into the 20th century, like de Groot and Garrigou-Lagrange, okay, they all hold that if the Pope becomes a heretic, the church has to come together, but you form a council and actually have a trial and give the Pope a warning, basically commit judgment on the Pope as a heretic. And then, if he's pertinacious, that's a sign that God has deposed him, and therefore it issues a declaratory sentence. Bellarmine argues that that's not possible if he's really still the Pope. So instead, he argues that a body of men, say the same similar thing with Suarez, a body of men must judge that he has been, by ipso facto, by that fact.
By the fact.
Deposed. So it has to be the bishops. It has to be the universal church. It's a judgment of the church. The factum of the ipso facto has to be determined by the church that this has happened. And then it gives a declaratory sentence, not a trial and not all these other kind of things like in the Dominican opinion, right? So now what's important is both of these positions are theological opinions. They're not theological facts. The magisterium of the church has never, ever given us a clear teaching of what would happen in this case, right? So Vatican I came very close. It was raised in some of the commissions dealing with papal infallibility. Well, should we talk about what happens when a pope's a heretic? And then, there was an eruption according to the Manzi in the Latin. And one of the cardinals said, nobody wants to hash that out. Because there was a realization that there were so many different opinions. It was composed of Jesuit and Dominican theologians and people who fell in between and on all different sides of that issue. So they realized that it would just be a contentious issue that would obstruct the work of the council. So let's just leave it alone. It's probably never going to happen anyway, right? So you can almost wish they had said something. But nevertheless, so it remains a theological opinion. So what this means is that when theologians teach in common, that is, and when the term theologian is a distinct term, it's not just anybody who writes on theology.
Okay.
It's rather people who, are in the schools or officially in a position as a theologian to some bishop that or the Pope that teach, various propositions, and they're in union and communion with the magisterium of the church through the bond of unity with their bishops, where their school is set up, where their university is set up, and other such things. So that's why the manuals, like the most famous one is Cardinal John Baptist Franzlin, who wrote his book on divine tradition, De Divina Traditione. It's only in Latin, although hopefully I'm fixing that soon. I just got one more chapter to finish, and that we can get that in English. But
okay.
Anyway, he was a peritus, an expert at Vatican I. And so he looked at all the different things of theologians, and he said that basically, quoting Blessed Pius IX in his magisterial teaching, that all theologians, when they're in common, are infallible. Because when they teach in common, in a true consensus, right? He goes to great pains to show what a consensus is and isn't. And then when that happens, because it's a sign that the Holy Spirit could not allow the church to err in her theologians, right? Universally. Individually, on the other hand, while you might reverence their authority, it might be rash to just simply reject them because they were merely a theologian. Actually, in the past, you get a censure from the Holy Office if you just said, like people do today, oh, he was just a theologian, we would have to listen to him, right? But on the other hand, that didn't make it a certain opinion. So he says, and I'm just quoting here from the Latin, this is De Divina Traditione, Thesis 17. This is Article 1, letter C, which is Roman number 1 in it, and letter C. Quando sententiarum est opinionum integravis theologos diversitas ex eorum auctoritate, certitudo comparare non potest. So that means when, among very serious theologians, there is a diversity of judgments and opinions, then from their authority, certitude cannot be discovered. Or to put it another way, nothing certain can be argued from it. And it says the same thing on the authority of just one father or such. So you might follow with greater, wisdom, or judge it to be safer, or what a more serious or authority, a more, great one. But what Cardinal Franklin says there is that if there's no consensus, nothing certain can be found in these judgments. So again, between Bellarmine and the Dominican opinion, both opinions, by the way, agree that you need a judgment of the church to tell you what's happened.
Right.
It can't be some armchair theologian reading the Drudge Report, Pope says X. Well, I determined he's a heretic and he's lost his office, right? That the Bellarmine would have thought that was absolutely absurd.
Well, it is absurd.
Here's where the rubber meets the road. Let's grant the argument as the Sedevacantists put it, which is absolutely absurd. Namely, which of course Bellarmine himself rejected, which is the second opinion, namely that as soon as he falls into heresy, he ceases to be pope. So therefore, John the 23rd, Pope Paul VI, Pope John Paul II, John Paul I for good measure too. He was only there for that. I don't know what he could have done in 30 days to be an anti-pope, but anyway, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis I. That all these popes were all manifest heretics, and not a single one of them are really popes. So what are the consequences of that ecclesiologically, right? So supposing that were true, and their reading of Bellarmine was right, and that's exactly what happened.
Okay.
Now let's see the effects. It's not just that a pope would lose his office per se. He lost his office. They were such manifest heretics that one, not a single person in the church noticed it until 1967 when the first Sedevacantists came along. So that's all of John XXIII in the beginning of Paul VI's pontificate. He's such a notorious heretic. Nobody knows it. But that's the first one. The second one is that, so what happens then? Well, you see, in the church is a visible society of members with the same profession of faith in the communion of the sacraments, united to their head, which is the Roman Pontiff, and their bishop in communion with the Roman Pontiff. That's Bellarmine's definition of the church, a visible society. So he goes into this in Book 4, chapter 23 and 24, and especially in 25, where he shows that essentially that all bishops get their jurisdiction directly from the Pope, not from God. So what's jurisdiction? Well, that's where we have to go to on the Marks of the Church, which is...
that's a different book.
It's a different book, so
right.
I'm just quoting right here from it. It's
okay.
So in the fifth mark, there's 4 marks of the church. 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Those are given in the creed. So Bellarmine unpacks those in all the different aspects. So he proposes 15 marks of the church that are all basically taken from those 4.
Okay.
So the 5th mark is the succession of apostles, or what we call is the mark of apostolicity. Okay, and that's one of the marks of the creed. In the mark, actually, the word in Latin is note, and I would have preferred to use that, but for the last 50 years in English, they've said the marks of the church, so I had to go with that. So the marks of the marks of the church are how you know. That's why in Latin they're note. They're how the church is known to be the church. So he says that this note of apostolicity is in the third argument here. He says that it requires 2 things: that some bishop should rightly be said to descend from the apostles and hence be a legitimate bishop. One aspect of that is succession. The other is ordination. As to succession, so that what he's saying there is that theologians distinguish this, that there's 2 things in apostolic succession. You have the sacred orders,
okay.
Right? Being a bishop, that gives you the capax in Latin, the ability to use the sacraments. Then you have the right to use the sacraments. That's formal succession. And that's what Bellarmine's talking about here. When he says succession, he means formal succession. When he says ordination, he means material succession, just being a bishop. right? So as to succession, it requires that he who desires to be counted as a true bishop should succeed some apostle in the way that Clement succeeded Peter and Polycarp succeeded John, or even succeed someone who was made an apostle, or sorry, who an apostle had made a bishop, such as Ignatius succeeded Evodius and Ananias, as well as Mark, whom Peter had made bishops.
Right.
Or at length, if the episcopate is a new one, it should be established by the Roman Pontiff. So this is what he says in the fifth. That's the fifth mark. If you have the book on the marks of the church, you can read that in the fifth mark. I forget exactly which chapter that is, which is on succession of bishops. So ultimately, so what that means is that the difference between, say, a schismatic and a Catholic is that the schismatic has the material succession. He has orders. But a Catholic has the right to use the orders. He has formal succession, which only comes from the Pope, right? So, and this is why, he buttresses his point on the Roman Pontiff, Book 4, Chapter 25, on the right to use the sacraments doesn't come from God himself. It comes from the Pope. Right? And the bishops hold that from the Pope. So what happens if a Pope dies? Well, the bishops still all have the right to use these sacraments. So from the previous Pope, so that they succeed the apostles in the right, the jurisdiction, right? So doing that, they're all actual bishops. Well, this Pope is dead, and the next one is elected. And so nothing ceases in the church. Ordinary jurisdiction, that's the right to use the sacraments, that remains in the church. Well, what happens if there's never a Pope elected again, right? Ever again, or like for another 60
Well, you couldn't have
years.
any ordinations then, could you?
Well, you could do ordinations and everything, and so you could pass on the material succession.
So
right?
a bishop could
But
ordain a priest, but how would a bishop couldn't be ordained? How could a bishop be ordained? How could a cardinal be ordained if there was no Pope?
Well, you couldn't have a cardinal,
okay,
because that comes directly from the Pope. A bishop you could have, depending on the rights to consecrate a bishop that would be conceded. So a patriarch typically has a right conceded in principle to consecrate a new bishop, so that it's like the patriarchs of Alexandria, Constantinople, in the early church, and Antioch. They all had the right to consecrate their own bishops for their regions and everything, because they were above them. So now today in the canon law you couldn't do that, but even as it was in 17, right? You couldn't do that. And so you could argue, oh well, there's an emergency situation, the popes are heretics, so we're going to consecrate bishops, right? And that's the sedevacantist argument for those who have gotten bishops from some crazy bishop that's ordaining everybody,
right?
Thuc-line bishops like Cardinal Thuc. I won't go to that now. But anyway, so they claim that, we have an emergency situation. There is no Pope, and the church is all going to hell, so we need to have these orders, right, to ordain these bishops. So they can do that. But they still don't have formal succession because it only comes from the Pope. No, where does it? Because bishops can't give the formal succession because it doesn't come from them. It comes from the Pope. You can't just pass it on, right? So once they're dead, in the reign of John Paul II, the last bishop with the right to use the sacrament would have died if the sedevacantists are right. The consequent is then there's no more ordinary jurisdiction in the church. That means that consequently there is no mark of apostolicity, and if there's no mark of apostolicity, there's also no mark of unity, because you're not in the unity of with the right to use these sacraments with the head. And if you don't have unity, you don't have oneness, Catholicity, which is being everywhere, and you're reduced to Calvin's invisible church. That's basically where the sedevacantists have brought us to. Calvin's invisible church.
Thanks, guys. Hey, this is the Modern Wrong World Made Right. This is Calvin Was Wrong, episode number 15. Ryan, we're going to have to leave it here. We still have one chapter left, although I think that you pretty much have been explaining chapter 31. Not completely and not by definition. But as I'm listening to you and I'm reading along and I'm skimming ahead in chapter 31, we just got a pretty good argument. But there's a lot there's a lot here towards the end of the chapter that I think is worthy of another session before we close out. So maybe we'll bring this to episode number 16 and do chapter 31 there. How about that?
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so that's what we'll do.